I'd like to acknowledge every single member of our organizing committee, Antoine Kasparian, Kim Hekimian, Sarkis Baluchian. Maral Choloyan was instrumental in her help as well. All the volunteers, who else? Media team. I had to write these things down. I'm not functional, very functional. Bookstore, and most importantly, every single speaker, panelist, moderator that served in this conference. Let's give them all a big round of applause. One announcement on behalf of the organizing committee. This event was done as a public service. As you know, most of the sessions were free of charge and open to the public. We would like it, we would love it if you help us cover the expenses of this conference by donations. On your way out, there are going to be envelopes. We would very much appreciate that. And without further ado, let's move on. Thank you very much.
So during this centennial year, we're commemorating the horrors of the past, but we're continuing to combat hard and soft forms of denial through various forms of scholarship. We're also looking forward in a variety of ways, in terms of forging relationships with the Turkish citizens of today, in terms of activism, and the genocide education, in terms of partnering with other people so that we really have a solid sense of Armenian issues being part of global social justice, in terms of transitional justice and reparations. But here now, we're closing this, celebrating who we are as Armenians and how our history has shaped us to be a people of strength and resilience and deep creativity who have much to offer to the world at large through the expressive arts. So first we're going to hear from Scout Tufangjian. She's a photojournalist based in Brooklyn, New York, and her work has been featured in so many major publications, from Newsweek to U.S. News & World Report, Le Monde, Newsday, and the New York Times. Her book, featuring a selection of photographs from Obama's presidential campaign, Yes We Can, sold out its initial 555,000 copy run a month before it was released. We've been enjoying her gorgeous photographs throughout the conference. Her photo of Michelle Obama and President Barack Obama hugging each other was the most liked photo on Facebook and the most retweeted tweet in history. And how lucky are we that here she is telling us about her work and the stunning Armenian Diaspora Project that's coming out this April. Her photographs and sparse captions speak on so many levels. In those of Eastern Anatolia, a place I haven't been to since 1984, I love how each caption has the current and the former name, or the current and former population of the number of Armenians who live there. In these beautiful, haunting pictures, she somehow implies that spiritual gap in the landscape that was so severely depopulated a century ago. Scout Tufangjian.
Hello, my name is Scout Tufangjian, and as she said, I have spent the last 6 years traveling around the world photographing Armenian communities. It's a little weird that I came to this. I grew up in Scituate, Massachusetts, which is about an hour outside of Watertown for people of you who are from Massachusetts. I'm half Armenian. My parents didn't speak Armenian in the house. We didn't belong to any of the organizations. We would go into Watertown to get lahmacun or go to the church bazaars, but basically I grew up outside of the community. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about, what does it mean to be Armenian? Am I Armenian? Do I count? And I spent a lot of weekends with my grandparents, who are here almost exactly 67 years ago. And they lived kind of like the old country. They would go to their friends' houses for a cup of swords or some tea, and they would talk for about 25 minutes, and then they would go to another friend's house. And every one of these friends had the Armenian magazines or newspapers on their coffee tables. And since I could only understand Armenian a little, I spent a lot of time looking through these magazines. And I was looking for people like me. I was looking to see what I had in common with a seminary student in Jerusalem or a soccer player in Argentina. What did I have in common with a student in Russia or a student in India or a student in Paris? You know, what was it that kind of drew us all together? I was really curious about this. And everywhere I went, I kept looking for this. I kept looking for this information. Like, where are we? What are we? I remember there was a map that had offices of different Armenian organizations all over the world, and I thought, wow, we're in Ethiopia, we're in India, this is amazing. And I dreamed of going to these places and finding out. And but all I could find when I went to the library or the bookstores or the video libraries was stories about the genocide, as if our story had ended in 1915. So I decided to find out for myself. I went to Syria, where I photographed the 2010 World Cup final. I played with little kids in the courtyard of Sırp Sarkis in Damascus. But it wasn't really until I was in Western Armenia that the project became focused. This picture is in Hajin. What was called Hajin is now called Sayımbeyli. There's one Armenian family who's still left. And this is Harpers, where probably many of your grandparents and great-grandparents are from, where my great-grandparents are from. And I became really angry. And it wasn't angry about what had happened to us, because I knew that. That was in my blood. I had grown up with it. We all know what had happened to us. What I was angry about was that people acted like we were ghosts. People acted like we were a disappeared people. And we are not a disappeared people. I mean, look around you. There's Armenians in 85 countries around the world. There are 8 million of us. We're amazing. We're alive. We're thriving. And that kind of became the driving force of the project, to be a story of survival rather than a story of what had happened to us. And I knew I wanted the project to be done this year because at the same time that we were mourning our losses, I wanted us to celebrate our strength and our survival. So I started out, and and it was amazing. I hung out in the wings with ballet dancers in Armenia. I listened to private cello rehearsals in Yerevan, a Beiruti student. I swam with resettled Syrian Armenian refugees in Karabakh on the border with Iran. I hung out with Birthright Armenia kids in their homestay. I mourned in Glendale on April 24th, and I celebrated Vartovar in Istanbul, in Kınılyada. It was an amazing experience. I danced on First Republic Day in Yerevan, and it became clear that our stories were one, that it wasn't just a story of the diaspora. That the diaspora, that we were in fact a global connected community, that the Armenians in Yerevan, the Armenians in Karabakh, these kids in Kolkata, we are all part of the same story. I played cards with men in Vakıflı, which is the only remaining Armenian village left in Turkey. I did not smoke cigarettes with, but played tavla with old men in Sancak camp in Beirut. I danced, in Australia with the AYF kids, and I had a Horvats party with the monks of San Lazaro Island, which we then watched. We watched Eurovision together. Which, if any of you watched Eurovision last year, sitting with a bunch of monks and explaining who Conchita was really complicated. They were like, I don't understand. She has a beard, but she's in a dress. Is it a man? Is it a woman? What's going on? And I was like, this is not my job. I don't understand. I can't explain this to you. I understand it, but, I was worried they would kick me off the island. I wasn't even allowed to kind of dance at the Horvats party. I hung out with kids who fix up cars in LA. I love these kids. One of the problems with this project was that when you come down to it, having dinner with an Armenian family in Beirut and having dinner with an Armenian family in Ethiopia and having dinner with an Armenian family in New Jersey, it's kind of the same, we're all, we kind of eat the same food and we interact with each other in kind of the same way. And so I was really worried that everything was just going to look the same. It was just going to be a lot of the same thing. And then I went to LA and I was like, oh, thank God. You guys are amazing. There were biker gangs that were all Armenians. These kids were so sweet, although one of them called me a mudblood for being half Armenian, which wasn't very nice. But, it was wonderful. Thank God for LA. These guys, boxers in Moscow. So I was hanging out with some Hamshem Armenians in Moscow, and they're very sweet and very serious. And they were saying, we're going to take you to the church in Moscow, and it'll be this great experience, the new church. If any of you have seen it, it's enormous. And I'm a photographer, and we're walking by, and all of a sudden I see these two guys, and there's a tire embedded in the ground, and they're hitting it with a metal mallet over and over again. And I'm, an American kid. I'm like, this is the greatest former Soviet Union thing in the entire world. I'm so excited. I took all these pictures. And the Hamshem kids were like, Scout, it's great, but they're not Armenian. We should go. This isn't part of your project. Until the guy hitting the what do you call it, the bag, turns to the other guy and goes, "Oh, Berjan Shadlave," and it turns out that it was the Union of Russian Armenian Sporting Club, and they were Armenian boxers, and I spent the afternoon with them attempting to teach me how to box. But as I was doing this, as I was having this amazing time all over the world with Armenians, I started to realize that what I was photographing was actually a really important time in our history, not just because it's 100 years since we've been sent into exile, but because of what's happening now. This little girl is in Kesab, and the Kesab community has been decimated. The Syrian community has been decimated. This picture was taken in Damascus. This is also Damascus. These families, all of the families that I met and photographed in Syria are now living in Yerevan or Beirut or the United States. It's an absolute tragedy. This is one of our strengths, one of our jewels was the Syrian community, and it's been decimated by the war. Families have been sent, refugees in Nagorno-Karabakh. And at the same time, the Ethiopian community, which was one of our oldest communities, is down to just a few families. The families I photographed in Egypt have all fled the post-revolutionary upheaval and are now living in Los Angeles. Entire villages in Armenia have been emptied of their working-age men as they seek work in Russia or, of all places, Turkey. And at the same time, the more secure communities like the United States and Canada, Argentina, Brazil are worried that the communities are fading into assimilation, that their physical survival is at the cost of our culture. And so I started to think, what does it even mean to be Armenian? Do you have to speak the language and practice all the same traditions of the old country? This is a photograph of a Armenian wedding in Anjar. So I photographed, the first day I was in Ethiopia, I photographed what was known as it was an Armenian wedding. I was taken to an Armenian wedding. The groom was half Armenian and half African Ethiopian. The bride was half African Ethiopian and half Italian Ethiopian, and they danced kef and they ate khorovats, and it was an Armenian wedding. And then you go to Anjar. Is anyone here Anjartsi? Okay, so Anjartsis are tough. They're called the Borj Hamoudis Odars. So what does it mean? What does it mean to be Armenian? Both of these people feel very Armenian. Both of these weddings, were Armenian weddings. Do you have to live the same way that we used to, dance all the old dances? Do you have to belong to the organizations? Is it the church? Is it the language? Is it is it the dances, the traditional costumes? What is it that makes us Armenian? Or is it something else? Is it something kind of more ineffable than that? Is it our shared history? Would our relatives even, or is it the things that we fought for? Is it Karabakh? Is it the things that we still care about? Would our relatives even recognize this party in Moscow or this party in Lebanon as being an Armenian party, which they all are. All of the kids in these pictures are Armenian. What is it that ties together these kids in France, in Paris, with these kids in Anjar? Is it our shared history? Is it the way that we adjusted to our new homes? This is my family, my poor father. It's my dad in his underwear there. He claims it's a bathing suit, but it's clearly not. Is it the old country? Is this idea we have of the old country, of what we left behind? Is it Dolma? It's probably Dolma. Or Yalanji, as my family would call this. William Saroyan said that it's the Armenian gestures meaning so much, the slapping of the knee and the roaring of laughter, the cursing, the subtle mockery of the world and its big ideas, the word in Armenian, the glance, the gesture, the smile. And we all know what he means. We all know what he means by that. We all see it when people get together. These men in Los Angeles and my great-great-grandfather and this man in obviously Los Angeles, because there's no other place this picture could have been taken, have something that tie them together. There is something that makes them all Armenian. These men in Sadarabad, in Beirut, in Borj Hamoud, these kids in Paris, the tough tug-of-war girls, these kids in Sanjak camp in Beirut, there is something that ties them all together. There's an invisible thread that ties this boy who's a Mykhitaryan monk, he's from Armenia, with this boy who is half African Ethiopian and half Armenian Ethiopian. They are part of the same history, the same culture. There's a thread that ties them together. This mother in Paris with this mother in the Armavir Valley in Armenia. There is something that ties them all together. These girls in DC who are about to, tell Congress to acknowledge the genocide, with these kind of, slightly snotty girls, traditional dancers in Yerevan. This gay rights activists in New York with this young couple in Moscow who got engaged 2 weeks after this picture and claimed that it's because of this picture. I don't really know about that, but I'll take the credit. This mother in Kharaba, this young family who have moved to the liberated territories and are starting their family there. There's something that ties with this mother who wanted to have her child in Aleppo. She's from Philadelphia. She wanted to go back to Aleppo to have her child there so her child could be connected to the Surya High community and be part of the Surya High community. These girls at the AYF camp in Cyprus with this girl who's experiencing monsoon season in India for the first time. There's something that ties us all together. Kevin Dubois, who is a French Armenian, said, when I meet an Armenian, it's like we've been friends forever. And that, I do not feel that with anyone else. The connection is right there due to our ancestors and history. And that is absolutely the case. I cannot tell you how many times I have just showed up somewhere, like in Buenos Aires. I knew one person in Buenos Aires. I showed up, you go to the Agump and you say, my name is Scout Tufangjian, part of this, and the next thing you know, you're in someone's house, your family, they're inviting you over for dinner, you're going to their son's wedding. I don't know if there's any other community like this. I mean, do the Greeks do this? It's really incredible. You can go anywhere in the world, and as long as there's another Armenian, there is a connection. This family in Kasab, I lived with this family for a week. The only reason I left is because I had to get married, which I tried to reschedule. And then I tried to get my husband to come to Kasab, and he was like, I don't have a visa, wine. So anyway, I would probably still be there. This family was amazing. They made Monty for me. And if any of you have made Monty, like actually made Monty, it's really hard. And these women in Anjar, it's this amazing connection between all of us. This family in Paris, the community that we share is it's what has helped us to survive, and it's part of what makes us strong. I'm going to leave you with the words from my friend Daniel Cholakian, who's from New York here. And I interviewed about 400 people, mostly online, and their thoughts are in this book. And I asked a lot of people, what do you like about being Armenian? What don't you like about being Armenian? I asked them all sorts of questions. And she said, in answer to the question, what do you like about being Armenian? She said, I don't really know how to answer this question. I like who it makes me. I like that I'm a fighter, and I'm righteous and passionate, and I feel like I have a century of survival in me. And that's what I've tried to do with this project, is instead of showing just our losses, which we know and we feel, to show our century of survival and to show our vitality. Thank you very much.
And now we're up for more wonder. We're going to hear from Eric Bogosian. And I remember tapping right into his frenzied anger when I was a young Armenian American in New York City back in the day. But now here we've mellowed, and he's a generous and we'll find out. He's a generous and tireless spirit. He talks to young writers about writing, and he says, don't listen to those teachers who say don't believe in yourself. Just keep on writing. Write and read and write, and then it will come true. And he has given us plays, novels. He's acted. He runs the gamut. And now he's going to read to us from his first foray into nonfiction. And we know it's going to be creative nonfiction of the very best sort, because the mind of the wonderful Eric Bogosian is behind it. So welcome, Eric.
And thanks for having me today. I'm just going to read to you from the book Operation Nemesis, which is coming out next month. And I've already mentioned a few people who've been helpful in getting this book together. But I just, at the luncheon yesterday, and the thank yous are in the book, of course, but I just want to mention today somebody who isn't here today, Aram Arkun, who was really, really key to getting this book together, helping me with translations and guiding me through Armenian history and all kinds of the kinds of things I had to learn in order to write this book. But I'm just gonna read because I spent so much time on this. I figure I might as well give you some of this effort rather than try and just talk off the top of my head. This is from the introduction. When I was a little kid, there was nothing I loved better than hanging out at my grandparents' house. In her sunny kitchen, my grandma Lucy would fashion honey-drenched Armenian pastries, while out in the backyard, Grandpa Mugerdich, I'm turning on the timer here, Grandpa Mugerdich roasted lamb shish kebab under the apple trees. After dessert, Grandpa might knock back a tiny glass of arak and tell me stories. I was held rapt by the horrific narratives he dredged up from his faraway past. In his sweetly accented English, Mugerdich would describe burning churches and sadistic horsemen. The stories would always end the same way. My grandfather would instruct me, "If you ever meet a Turk, kill him." I was no more than 4 years old when I first heard those words. My grandfather had spent his boyhood in the troubled eastern frontier of the Ottoman Empire more than a century ago. He had plenty of reason to hate the Turks, who had killed his father and almost killed him. In 1915, when he was barely 21 years old, Mugerdich escaped the genocide that would exterminate hundreds of thousands of his fellow Armenians. More than once, he told me the story. It seems a little loud. Can we turn down just a little bit? Because I hear echo. It's good? Okay. More than once, he told me the story of how his village burned while he and his mother crouched down in the middle of a wheat field, hiding from the Zapata. Under darkness of night, they fled, managed to find passage to France, and in 1916, Mugerdich and my great-grandmother emigrated to the United States from Le Havre. My grandfather claimed that he had survived because he was smarter than the rest. That's why I was such a smart little boy. But perhaps it was just luck. Mugerdich's own father was not so lucky. Ovagin Jamgochen, after successfully emigrating to the United States in the 1890s, had gained American citizenship. But he made the mistake of returning to the old country to find his wife and teenage son. The Young Turk government didn't recognize his American citizenship, and he was swept up with hundreds of thousands of other able-bodied men and drafted into the army. His conscription would become a death sentence. Within months of being drafted, Ovagin, like most of the Armenians in the Ottoman army, was disarmed and then forced into a labor battalion where Christian soldiers were worked to death. All we know is that his family never saw him again. My grandma Lucy also lost her father, Kumjan the jeweler, who once worked in the Constantinople bazaar. As far as we know, Lucy's father, like Ovagin, also died violently. I understood from a young age that I was an Armenian, and this meant that my family, like countless other Armenian families, had lost loved ones at the hands of the Turks. But knowing this and embracing it were two different things. Most of my freckle-faced friends in Woburn, Massachusetts, were of Irish-American ancestry, blissfully unaware of their own harsh history. Though I was olive-skinned and kinky-haired and attended the Armenian, not Roman Catholic Church, I saw myself, like them, as nothing more than a carefree American kid. The horrors that had touched the lives of my grandfather's generation had not touched me. I was not an immigrant, I spoke perfect English, and I had zero interest in emphasizing anything that would exaggerate the differences between me and my classmates. Horrible things had happened back in the old country, but there was a disconnect between that carnage and my sweet existence as a suburban teenager. My life growing up in a Massachusetts subdivision was filled with pot-smoking teenagers in torn jeans who barely paid attention to school and in their spare time protested the Vietnam War. In another universe, a long time ago, Kurdish tribesmen armed with pistols and knives had terrorized villagers and abducted young Christian women. My grandfather's world was genuinely dangerous. The stories I had heard at his knee were so intense they seemed mythic, unreal, more like adventure stories than real life. These events had taken place in a land 1,000,000 miles away, a place my grandfather called Armenia. I loved Armenian food, I loved Armenian weddings, and the strange choral music sung in our churches, but I was an American kid, not an Armenian. As I began my career as an author and actor, I refrained from emphasizing my roots. I didn't want to be pigeonholed as an exotic ethnic actor, and if I was going to write about the human condition, I would represent the world I knew. the leafy suburbs of New England, and later the streets of New York City, not the harsh plains of Anatolia, of which I had no direct experience. The Armenian history that I had come to know through my grandfather's stories was not my history. I had not suffered in the desert. I had not lost loved ones there. I had not witnessed atrocities firsthand. Why should I be the one to write about those sad events from so long ago? When I first heard about the assassination of Talat Pasha about 20 years ago, the story seemed more like wishful thinking than the truth. Mehmet Talat Pasha, a leader of the Ottoman Empire, which became the more modern Republic of Turkey during World War I, had been assassinated in 1921 in Berlin by a young Armenian. The twist was that this young engineering student, Soghomon Tehlirian, was acquitted and set free. A supreme act of vengeance had seemingly been pardoned. To most Armenians, this made perfect sense. Talat was a monster. He was responsible for a massive tragedy, and Tehlirian slew him, like David slew Goliath. Like my grandfather's stories, Talat's death brought to mind an episode from a 19th century novel. When I came upon a reference to Tehlirian, again in Peter Balakian's Black Dog of Fate, and a few years later in Samantha Power's Pulitzer Prize-winning book on genocide, A Problem from Hell, I realized that this was not some kind of Armenian urban legend. Peter Balakian, whose great uncle had been a witness at Tehlirian's trial, and Samantha Power told the same tale. Tehlirian had been a survivor of the genocide who had seen his entire family brutally massacred by Turks. He had then chanced upon Talat, who was in hiding in Berlin after the war. After his arrest, Tehlirian explained to the police that he had been driven to shoot Talat by the effect of all that he had witnessed. Incredibly, the judge and jury sided with the young assassin, sympathizing with his suffering and loss. The June 4th, 1921 New York Times headline summed it up. They simply had to let him go. I found the transcript of Tehlirian's trial online. It was packed with gruesome details of Soghomon's ordeal as well as a blow-by-blow description of the assassination. Why wasn't there a book or a film based on Tehlirian? I wondered. Clearly, the killing of Talat and Tehlirian's exoneration were tailor-made source material for a motion picture. I could easily imagine the structure of a big film. Act 1, the deportations and massacres in the desert. Act 2, Berlin, the assassination. Act 3, the trial and triumphant acquittal. A true story filled with pathos and complexity. And history. I had finally found an Armenian subject that would challenge me as a writer and memorialize my beloved grandfather. I decided to set aside a few months to write the screenplay. And I should add here, and it's not here in the introduction, which is for Odars and not for you, that that I had been sort of had my Armenian roots turned on by being in Atam Egoyan's film Ararat. And it was on that set that being around representations of Van and seeing people dressed in the way people were dressed in those days, something happened. I don't know what happened. I was transported in some way, and suddenly I understood that I had to make this connection to my own heritage in a deeper way than I ever had. I've always been proud to be Armenian. I just felt that I was also American. I guess I didn't really completely understand how Armenian I was. At any rate, so I wanted to do something, and this turned out to be the piece. As soon as I began to sketch out a draft, obvious questions came to mind. How does an engineering student manage to kill a man who has spent his life surrounded by bodyguards, and with one shot, in the middle of a busy street, in the middle of the day? How did Tehlirian, a man who could barely speak German, get his hands on a gun in post-war Berlin? Was Tehlirian really a student? There was no evidence of his attending classes or having any friends who were students. If he wasn't a student, what was he doing in Berlin in the first place? How did he support himself? He didn't seem to have a job. I read the court transcript over and over again. Something was wrong with this picture. Then I discovered Resistance and Revenge, a dense monograph published in France in the 1980s by the journalist Jacques Desroches, which explained that in fact the young Armenian was not an engineering student at all, nor as it turns out had he been a witness to the massacre of his family in the desert. At the time of their deportation, he hadn't even been living in Turkey. Desrosiers laid out an even more remarkable, almost unbelievable story. A small group of Armenian conspirators with headquarters in the United States, actually Boston, calling themselves Operation Nemesis, had successfully organized the assassination not only of Talat, but also of most of the Turkish leaders responsible for the genocide. Neither Peter Balakian nor Samantha Power had made much of the Nemesis conspiracy. Neither had mentioned its long list of victims. They focused on Tetlerian and repeated the story he told in court. I needed to know more. Over the next 7 years, I immersed myself in an exploration of history and horror and what the judge at Tetlerian's trial called a tradition of bloody vengeance. I found links to British intelligence, and I reviewed recent research on interference in the trial by German officials. I asked scholar Aram Arkun to translate Tetlerian's 1953 memoirs, originally published in Armenian, and his work allowed me to deepen my understanding of this complex conspiracy. These men were contemporaries of my grandfather. Some had grown up only 100 or so miles from where my grandfather was born, but they were nothing like my grandfather. My grandfather could hate Turks, but could he have ever killed one? It is one thing to hate, to wish harm on one's enemy, but it is a very different thing to step up to someone on the street and put a bullet in his brain and watch him die. My grandfather wanted me to know what had happened to him long before I was born. He wanted me to be ready for the worst. He wanted to save me. And so he told me terrible stories and he warned me about the Turks. I'm sure he could never have imagined his young grandson actually killing a Turk, but he had said what he had said and it never left me. He shared his memory with me, the most valuable thing he owned. Tetlerian and his cohorts were not simply avengers. They were a small group of men, including a Boston newspaper editor, a Syracuse CPA, that's Marion's grandfather, Sachaklian, and a Washington diplomat who, through their actions, tried to offset in some way the anonymous deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians who died in the deserts, in their homes, and in mountain wastelands. No headstones mark where those victims of Talat and his gang fell. Nothing is left of them but our memory of them. To the 1.5 million Armenians who perished at the hands of Ottoman Turks during the First World War, and to their countless descendants, the actions of Operation Nemesis shouted, "You existed, you are memorable, we remember you." For almost 100 years, the story of this controversial band of men has been clouded by myth. I wrote this book because I had no choice. The Nemesis story required more attention than a simple screenplay. I've done my best to tell it as honestly and completely as possible. In this way, I honor memory. And I'd just like to jump to the end of the book. So you won't even really need to read the book. You can just, you just get the ending and you get the best parts, right?
You still have to buy it?
You have to buy it, though. For $20, it's your vote. I see this book. I said this also yesterday. This book is kind of a kind of Trojan horse. It delivers the genocide to those who maybe just want to read a book about assassination and don't know about the genocide, because it's remarkable as I've been giving the book out to reviewers and people who are not Armenian, how little people know of the Armenian genocide. In fact, know nothing about it. I don't even know how that's possible, but they don't. Also, most Armenians don't really know much Armenian history. I know all you guys do, but like where Armenia is, and so a lot of that is in this book as well. This is what I just finished with, and this will be the last things I say today. My grandfather told me stories from his life. It was his gift to me. Memory lies at the center of the Nemesis story. It is the engine of an intense bloodlust. We remember, but we remember differently. Our respective narratives lead to different actions. Thus, the conundrum of history. Were you there? Did you actually see it? Who told you about it? How can you be sure? Operation Nemesis is only one link in a historical chain that began long before its actors were born and that continues to this day. The Hamidian massacres of the late 19th century gave birth to Armenian revolutionary groups that fought the Ottoman government in eastern Anatolia. The Ottoman government, under the Young Turks, shrouded by the fog of war, used this activity as a justification for liquidating an entire indigenous population. And though tribunals were held after the war, little was done in the end to bring the perpetrators to justice. Operation Nemesis was born and carried out its mandate. And then, a half-century after the genocide, as the Turkish government persisted in its refusal to acknowledge one of the greatest mass murders in history, a new generation rose up and initiated an anarchic string of assassinations. In 2007, one more link in the chain was forged with the tragic assassination of the Armenian-Turkish editor Hrant Dink. And so memory and retribution are linked. But why? Why is it so important to remember what happened? All people who live will die someday, and in a few generations, most of us will be forgotten altogether. So why does it make any difference whether the details of our particular deaths are remembered, violent, or not? Perhaps the answer lies in the very fact that we do all die, that no one cheats death. We come into this world with nothing and we leave with nothing. We all know, either implicitly or explicitly, that all we really have in our place is our place in the memories of others. We exist to the degree that we know and remember one another, even the most isolated among us. We share a collective understanding that we are all part of a greater whole. Perhaps we will not be remembered as individuals, but we, the living, move through life surrounded by what the dead have left for us. The dead live on in the pages of thousands of books, in the bricks of countless buildings, in the flickering shadows of old movies, in virtually everything we see and touch, including our own children. For this reason, we must respect the dead. It is this contract of respect we have with those who have gone before us that demands we acknowledge how they died, and if they died violently, to seek redress. The question that is almost impossible to answer is what we should do if those who committed the original crime go unpunished. What if those who follow in the footsteps of those who committed the original crime insist on hiding the truth? What then? In the end, is there such a thing as justice? This book is an attempt, and again, I go on with what this book is about. So, it's an attempt to meditate on an answer, not only by providing the facts as best we know them, but also by research and authorship. I just want to, in the last 10 seconds of what I have to say up here, I normally create by making things up. I'm a playwright and I'm a novelist. I keep making up things as they make sense to me. This was a reverse process where everything had already happened, and it was my job to detect and find what had happened and try and make sense out of the characters. And I did this by reviewing and re-reviewing repeatedly over years the documents, the books, the sources, and interviews until I could start to see, almost like a picture developing before me, what the truth is. And I want to thank Marion, if she's here today, because she very generously allowed me to read the letters, which are in her book, Sacred Justice, which I highly recommend that you read, also about Operation Nemesis. It's an incredible story. It's a remarkable story. This small group of men essentially changed world history, and I'm honored to have been able to complete this task, and that's all I really have to say. Thank you.
Alexander Dinelaris is our next speaker. He is the winner of the 2015 Academy Award for the Best Original Screenplay for Birdman. Or The Unexpected Virtue of Ignorance. What a brilliant movie, oozing with originality, voice, and insight. Dinelaris came to writing through the theater. At this conference, we've spoken a lot about comparisons between the Jewish Holocaust and the Armenian Genocide. Well, we have Tevye, one of his very first roles in Fiddler on the Roof as an actor, and from there he went into directing, and then playwriting, and now screenplay writing. I think a thread that runs through his work is a connection through the generations. We see that in Birdman and the beautiful relationship between the father and daughter. We'll see it in his forthcoming movie, The Monarchs, about the monarchs, Among the Monarchs.
The Year of the Monarchs.
The Year of the Monarchs, thank you, The Year of the Monarchs. And we certainly saw it in his harrowing look at the legacy of the Armenian Genocide in Red Dog Howls. So welcome, Alexander Dinelaris.
First to say I'm honored to be sitting at this table with these artists. It's incredible for me. I'll be sort of brief. I don't know why I wrote Red Dog Howls. I, like Scout, was raised Armenian, but wasn't involved heavily as I grew up in the community. Through circumstances in my own family, I was, as a very small child, 1 through, let's say, 4 or 5, I was left with my grandmother, Rose Vartui, who raised me as her own, and I did not have my mother in my life and my father on the weekends, and sometimes better, but really raised by my Armenian grandmother. And I think that the DNA of who you are and who you become is who you're with and what you're taught at those formative years. And my grandmother was everything in the world to me. Years later, my wife and I were trying to have a child and having a tough time of it. We'd gone through several miscarriages, and it wasn't going well. And we had a pregnancy stick, and we made it past the markers that are meant to be passed when you're allowed to tell people that this is happening. And it was at that time that I realized that I had carried this sadness. My father had carried this sadness. Though our family, my uncle's here, his brother's here, Tony, though we joke a lot, it's a very humorous family. I think you find that in a lot of Armenian families that you find. The sense of humor is raucous and sometimes obnoxious. Though we laughed a lot, there was always a sadness, always something dark. And my grandmother had, when at nighttime she would share stories of me that were sort of inappropriate for a 4-year-old to hear as well. And I never forgot them. And so when we finally had this pregnancy hold, it occurred to me that I wanted to find out what the root of the sadness was and to try to extricate it before my child was born, because I was afraid that she would inherit it. So I went on a trip to Greece, and I was sitting on the stones of the Theater of Dionysus and looking at the stage and thinking about the Greek structure, and all of a sudden an idea occurred to me about a play, and that play was Red Dog Howls. And Red Dog Howls is a play, it's very similar, it could be a companion piece to Chris's book, Sandcastle Girls, in that I find with the Armenian genocide that it's an act of searching, where we talk about the history or the art in writing about the Jewish Holocaust. There's multitudes of visual evidence, which is very compelling, far more compelling than any written evidence you could find. And that gives you a concrete base to say, this happened, this is what's justice, this is what's right, you can see it for yourself. With the Armenian genocide, we have about 11 grainy photos. There are more, but you get my point. We know the ones. And they horrify us, and that's what we have. We have a governments and people in denial. We have a very muddy string of visual evidence. And so I find with Chris's book and Red Dog Howls, the journey was similar. 2 writers going back, they find their grandmother. We did not collaborate. Someday, yes. And through this person, the revelation of this person who they reveal to, who happens to twice over be a maternal figure, feeds them, in my play, literally and figuratively, their history. I find about Red Dog Howls the letters that I still get. Nora was here just saying how moved she was. The letters are amazing, and it's a tough play, and I didn't write it in a sense of realism. It's very sort of Greek in its structure. But in the play itself, what I found was that the key to writing about the Armenian genocide was to stop making it about Armenians. Strangely enough, it was to stop making it about Armenians. When we say this is us and this is what happened to us, it's true and it's making testament and there's a place for that. But I find in art, it's about the universality of it. And the more specific you are about the people, the more universally you can appeal. And so I had people who were Irish and Jewish and Greek and Russian who came up to me afterwards and said, that's not an Armenian grandmother, that's my grandmother. She yelled at me, she fed at me, she, told me to take off my shoes and socks in the house, she taught me to play cards. Not too many people said she arm wrestled with me, which is in my play. But what I found was that it affected people in that way, and I think that's the key, is humanizing somebody, because we're not Armenian. An atrocity against a human being is an atrocity against all of us, whether that's somebody from the Congo, or whether that's somebody from Armenia, or whether that's somebody from Poland. And so I would say going forward is that Aristotle there's an Aristotelian philosophy about surprising inevitability, saying you get to the end of a piece and you say, holy cow, I can't believe that happened. And in the next breath you say, of course that happened. They told me that was going to happen the whole time. I just didn't want to believe it. Genocide in its own is shocking inevitability. It's happening today. And we say, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening today. And we all here, especially in this room, say, of course it's happening today. Of course it's happening today. So I think if we can do anything as writers or artists, photographers, novelists, it's to make it about us, and that hope that human beings will identify with us, because there's more of us than there are of them. Whether they're ISIS or whether they're Nazis, or whether there's more of us than there is of them. We have to remember that, and it's the only thing we can appeal to. The only thing. I don't know why I wrote Red Dog Howls, but my grandmother died long, long time ago, and I never got to say thank you. And I never felt a burden bigger than the last 12 pages of my play. It was the hardest thing I will ever have to write. I remember having to sit back from the keyboard because I was crying on the computer, and I was afraid I was going to destroy my computer. I couldn't afford another one at the time. I know now that I wrote that play not only for my grandmother, but for everybody my grandmother was crying for everybody that cried about anything like this. I wrote Red Dog Howls because it's about everybody in this room and everybody that came before us. And that's all I have to say. I thank you for your time. That's all. Thanks.
Chris Bojalian. He's a wonder. We all know what an eloquent spokesperson Chris is regarding Armenia. We know he has 17 books, including 10 New York Times bestsellers. So follow his advice. Order Eric's book on Amazon. Scouts too. Scouts too. And I should have talked to Chris before my book was coming out. I was doing support your independent bookseller. So at any rate, but he is an absolute wonder. He's, what you might not know about him is that he's also a powerhouse in the Vermont legislature, where he brings his imagination and his charm to ensuring that our very blue state isn't overrun by Azeri oil money. It's formidable that he keeps on bringing in new resolutions, getting the Armenian community, and we're small but we're strong, in Vermont, mobilized to do good things. So.
Oh, thank you, Dana John, for that lovely introduction. It is a pleasure, it is an honor, it is a privilege to be wrapping up Responsibility 2015. And oh my gosh, I love the fact that this is a monumentally difficult series of acts to follow. Scout, you know how much I love your book and your photographs. It is so reassuring to see that yes, we are still the mountain. Eric, if anyone is going to bring Operation Nemesis to life for the world, it is you, and I am so glad you are doing it. Alex, I revere your work, not simply Birdman, not simply Red Dog Howls, but I am waiting for The Bodyguard to come from the West End to Broadway. And of course, Dana. Dana's my fellow high tide warrior in Vermont, and of course, the author of a new book like Water on Stone about this part of our history. Thank you all so much for letting me join you. I would wager that virtually everyone in this room has either read The Sandcastle Girls or is aware of The Sandcastle Girls or has been subjected to hearing me babble about The Sandcastle Girls. So given the fact that the purpose of this panel is art and genocide, I thought I would do two things. I would discuss very specifically why the Sandcastle Girls is structured the way it is structured from a perspective of art and genocide. And I want to talk a little bit about the strange, unexpected places where the imaginary family and the Sandcastle Girls and my family actually overlap. So I want to begin with the oldest family photograph in the Bokhchalian family archives. I bring you to Kayseri at the very end of the 19th century, and I want to draw your attention to two of the players in this photograph. The little boy on his father's lap, that is Levon Nazareth, my grandfather. His father, Nazareth Bedros, well, we will talk more about him in a moment. Let's fast forward 36 years to New York City. There's another family portrait, and there is Levon Nazareth again, now as the family patriarch. I love this family photograph of my father and my grandparents. I love my father in the short pants, the big wide ears, the necktie that falls 2 inches above his navel. Standing beside him, my grandmother, Haigui. Elegant gray-black dress, a white collar, a corsage the size of a softball. In my beautiful grandmother, Haigui Shodinian, I see glimpses of my beautiful 21-year-old daughter, Grace Experience. And sitting in the chair is Levon. He's wearing a suit. This is Westchester County where I grew up, and in my memories, my grandfather is always wearing a suit. I remember once going up to my Aunt Rosemary, his daughter, and saying, "Aunt Rosemary, when I think of Grandpa, he's always wearing a suit. When you were a little girl, was he always wearing a suit?" And she laughed and laughed and said, "No, Chris, of course not. I remember one time when he was cleaning the oil burner, he took off his jacket." Levon and Haigui were survivors of the Armenian genocide. And like so many survivors, they took most of their stories to their graves. We know bits and pieces. My grandmother, Haigui Shodinian, her father provided cavalry horses to the Ottoman army and had for years. In 1915, rather than acquire the horses legally, they simply shot him to death, confiscated the herd, confiscated the horse farm, and then for good measure, confiscated the Shodinian home in Bolis. My grandfather, Levon, you saw in that photograph that he has 3 older brothers. In 1915, against all odds, they are alive in Cairo. They are alive, they've made it. And yet somehow, between 1915 and the mid-1920s, when my grandparents wed in Paris, all 3 brothers would be lost to the mists of history. My grandfather would never speak of them, and to this day, we do not know what happened to them. One final footnote before I move on. Levon is in his father's lap. He is the youngest child, and he is a late-in-life child. He is born at the very end of the 19th century. His father, my great-grandfather, Nazareth, is going to die in 1902. This will matter. Now, The Sandcastle Girls is not the first time that I tried to write a novel of the Armenian genocide. I tried way back in 1993 and 1994, wrote the entire manuscript, 392 pages. And when I finished reading it, I realized it was absolutely unpublishable. A train wreck. The single worst novel ever written, published or unpublished. The manuscript actually exists in my alma mater in Western Massachusetts, and if you are a scholar or a masochist, you can go there and read it. I would discourage you. It is a bad book. This is not a novelist's hyperbole. So why did I try again? Why in 2010 did once again I embark upon a novel of the Armenian genocide? Well, there are three reasons. First of all, because all of us in this room know well the story is so important. There's a direct link between the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, the Cambodian killing fields, Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur. It is a very, very long list. Secondly, because while all of us know the story so well, the reality is that for most of the world, the Armenian genocide remains, as my narrator Laura Petrosian will call it in the novel, the slaughter you know next to nothing about. And then there's a third reason, and I call him the Godfather. He's my great friend, Hachig Muradian, and I can never in good conscience talk about the Sandcastle Girls without giving him a shout out. In 2010, on February 2nd, Hachig and I were having a cup of coffee in Boston, and Hachig knew two important things about me. He knew, number one, that my father's health was failing, and he knew, number two, that there was this unpublished novel of the Armenian genocide I had written, moldering in the archives of my alma mater. And Hachig said to me over coffee, when are you going to try again? Not if, not are you, but when. And if you know Hachig, you know he is nothing if not persistent. I had my marching orders, and so I did. But I knew this time, if I was going to succeed, I needed to approach the material very, very differently than I had 15, 16 years earlier. Why was that first manuscript so flawed? Well, first of all, because the first time I tried to write about the genocide, it was strong on numbers and demographics, and it was weak on character. It referenced all of the places that we know well, but people outside of the Armenian community cannot find with a map. If you cannot read the sign, it says, Der Zor. The ruins were never in context. This is a photograph I actually took in Lake Van. If you want to see spectacular, beautiful photography from Western Armenia, turn to Matthew Karenian. And the bones, and this is a photograph I took in Antelius, the Genocide Memorial Chapel. The bones were all too often nameless. Every page was a massacre. Every page was our men being disarmed and bloodied. Every page was another account of the way our women were brutalized, abducted, kidnapped, and raped. It was a younger novelist's cathartic venting of fury, but it wasn't a novel. And so when I tried again, years later, I approached the material very differently. And the very first thing I realized is that this story needs both text and subtext. To write this story, and I was not writing this book for all of us in this room today. We know the story. Our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents endured the story. I was writing it for readers in Indianapolis, in Jacksonville, and Portland, Washington, Portland, Oregon, who know nothing of the Armenian genocide. And so the first thing I needed to do was to create a narrator who can provide essentially one of those black and yellow books, The Armenian Genocide for Dummies. Replace ukulele with Armenian genocide, replace the ukulele with an oud. And you can see what Laura Petrosian, my narrator in the Sandcastle Girls, is setting out to do. Her goal is to say, okay, reader, in 1915 began a cataclysmic genocide, the systematic annihilation of 1.5 million Armenians, and you know nothing about this crime. And then she has to say to the reader, but don't feel like a moron. Don't feel like a dope. There is a reason you don't know, and of course, we've talked a lot about the G word this weekend. In this case, it's the D word, denial. This is an op-ed that I had in the Boston Globe on Monday, very specifically about Turkey's continued denial. So that is the place of Laura Petrosian. She can explain, and she can explain why you don't know. The other thing is this. If I were to write a novel, 1.5 million dead in the desert, no one is going to buy it. Consequently, I framed the novel as a love story. A big, sweeping, epic love story set in Aleppo. And who are the lovers? Again, I made a very conscious decision that one half of the lovers was going to be an American, in Odar. Mount Holyoke class of 1915, Elizabeth Endicott, who travels to Aleppo, Syria with a Boston-based Friends of Armenia. She's a red-headed Spitfire, and there she meets Armen Petrosian, an Armenian engineer. And in terms of the love story, I wanted to also approach it from the perspective of history, so that everything in the book is authentic. You won't see a biplane, and I wanted to cut to this particular image. This is the sort of love story that inspired the Sandcastle Girls, The English Patient. I went with the movie jacket rather than the novel jacket because of the biplane. It's going to come back. Other models, Atonement, big, sweeping love story. Of course, The English Patient is set immediately before and during the Second World War in Italy. Atonement is set immediately before the Second World War in Dunkirk and the United Kingdom. And I want to come back to Armen Petrosian, because here is the other thing I wanted to do. Armen is in Aleppo looking for his beloved wife Karine, his infant daughter Talin. So much of the narrative of our story is about victimhood, and I did not want Armen to be a victim. One of my favorite novels growing up was The 40 Days of Musaddam. I wanted Armen to have the fire of the ancestors of the Anjaris. Consequently, if you are reading The Sandcastle Girls, you know that Van figures in the novel. Before Armen sets off for Aleppo, he's defending the Armenian quarter. He is winning in the defense of the Armenian quarter. I'm thrilled with the way the romance of the novel has been picked up around the world. This is the United Kingdom cover for The Sandcastle Girls, and I love this cover. It's sort of Downton Abbey meets The English Patient. And I don't know if you can see it, but the biplane is back! This is the Norwegian edition that was published in January, Sandcastle in Aleppo. And I wanted to share this jacket with you because it's deeply poignant for me to see Aleppo. This is the Aleppo of the young lovers, Armen and Elizabeth. This is the Aleppo that Scout could have been photographing in 2010. And of course, as we know, this Aleppo is gone. This Aleppo is under siege. Most of the foreign editions, however, replicate the American cover. Elizabeth Endicott, white dress, white parasol. This is the Brazilian edition that was just published. Elizabeth Endicott is not my grandmother, not by any stretch. Remember, my grandmother is Haigui Shodinian. But here is where the strange and unexpected places at midlife, where the imagined and the real have strangely coalesced. I have always assumed that I am the first Bokjalian to try to make art from the genocide, to try to use art to tell this part of our story. Remember Nazareth Bedros? Well, what we knew about him growing up, what even my Aunt Rosemary, his granddaughter, knew about him growing up, was this. He was a carpenter in Kayseri who occasionally dabbled as a poet. He wrote a poem now and then. That was what we knew. Carpenter dabbled in poetry. This is an old Armenian encyclopedia about the Armenians of Kayseri. And my great friend and godfather Hachig, despite all that is going on in his life, translated for me this autumn the 5-page entry in this encyclopedia about Nazareth Bedros Bokjalian. It seems that Nazareth wasn't a carpenter who dabbled in poetry. He was a poet who dabbled in carpentry. He was a prodigy who at the age of 13 was whisked from Kayseri because his poems were so beautiful and his voice was so powerful, and he was brought to Jerusalem. He was brought to Bolis. In the 1870s and the 1880s, he was the closest thing the Anatolian plains had to a rock star. He was a troubadour, traveling and singing. His poems, well, they were almost Whitman-like in their celebration of the villagers. There may even have been a trace of Gomitas in his fascination with the folk songs and the traditions in the community. And then something happened. In 1896, he wrote an epic poem, not about the village life. It is a 70-quatrain poem about the Hamidian massacres and what he witnessed and what occurred among his neighbors, among the quatrains that Hachik translated for me. They killed infidels with axes, daggers, and didn't ask who you were, whether merchant or coolie. They took the babies out of the wombs of their mothers, and those who witnessed lost their minds. Again, think Gomatas. I shared with many of you yesterday who were at the lunch crowd that I found my voice as a novelist years and years ago. But it was only with the Sandcastle Girls that I found my heart. When we talk of the genocide, often we talk about the numbers of souls who have perished, and we all know the numbers, the 6 million, the 1.5 million. We know the numbers. But with every one of those souls went a story. I have always been so proud to be my father's son. I have always been so proud to be my grandfather's grandson. But it was only this autumn at midlife, thanks to Hachik, that I discovered I am equally as proud to be the great-grandson of a poet I never met. When I finished The Sandcastle Girls, I knew it was the most important book I was ever going to write. But I didn't know that first it would give me back my heart, and then it would give me my soul. Thank you.
That was breathtaking. I mean, 4 just stunning presentations that show, I mean, the people working in multiple domains, the deep intelligence running through all of their works. I mean, who knew that Aristotelian structure was part of Birdman? I didn't, and that's what kept it grounded. Scout working back and forth between integrating text and interviews with those images that already speak so much. Eric taking on research, 7 years of research to bring this important piece of history to all of us. And then Chris finding out, getting back his heart and soul, which I think were always there, but now they're even stronger. We have time for questions.
I just wanted to ask each of you or any of you to reflect on how that has an impact on your work and your ability to reach outside of the Armenian world, which is very important. Thank you.
You spend a lot of time thinking about what it means to be Armenian. My Rupin Jambezian in here has a kind of, he describes growing up in Toronto, and one of the things he says is that everything was there for him: the cultural center, the schools, the camps. Being Armenian was something that he didn't have to think about. It just was part of his life. He grew up, he went to an Armenian-speaking school. It was there for him. And for me, being Armenian is something I had to think about. I had to think about what that means and what it means to me and what it means to everyone. And so I think when you think about it that much, it allows you to communicate that to other people.
My father wanted to be as American as he possibly could, growing up in this house that my mother would later christen the Ottoman Annex of the Metropolitan Museum of Art because it felt so exotic to her. So it was actually my grandparents, Levon and Hygrid, who helped me remember that part of my soul and that part of my history. But the reality is that for much of my life, I think I was like that Scott Fitzgerald reference, the little boy with his fingers pressed against the glass looking in at the party to which he wasn't invited. And the great thing about discovering at midlife, this inner Antonik in me, is that I've been invited into the party by everyone at the ARF and everyone at the ANCA and everyone at the AYF and everyone at the ANCC and everyone at the Armenian National Committee of Australia. So I thank all of you.
Being Armenian was part of my childhood, as part of my upbringing as a young boy, and now it feels like a memory. It feels like, which is sad because my father's passed away and my grandmother passed away, as I said a while ago. But connecting in moments like these, when we did Red Dog Howls in Los Angeles, you feel instantly connected again, and I think it's something that becomes part of who you are in the deepest sense. And even though you may not, I still go to my Armenian relatives for Easter every year, and it's what we hold on to. They're much more Armenian than I, but it feels like something fundamentally in the roots. And every time I hear a story or any of these stories or those photos, I feel instantly connected. So it's still strongly part of the DNA, though it's been gone for a long, long time. And I still, speak the 17 words I know to my 2 daughters. But I'll leave it to my Uncle Tony.
I talk to my dog in Armenian.
Yeah.
Let's see, do I push this? Okay. Well, I think there's a time in a person's life when they get, I guess, for me, it's when the kids came back from college and were working, and millions of hurdles seem to have been gone past, and then here I am. I'm me. What was this story that I've been living my whole life? And I turn over my shoulder and say, so what has this all been, and who am I? And I think I was racing forward so hard in my life for so many years, thinking that, well, I'm this guy who writes plays, or I'm this guy that's on this TV show. This is me. And then everything kind of stops and you have a chance to really say, who am I? And I guess that hierarchy, the notion that something that happened that maybe got applause at one point in my 30s it isn't more important than being in the backyard with Megadich watching him cook shish kebab. And really looking back and embracing who I was and really holding on to it is, I think, part of maturing as a person and reaching back and feeling those roots. I think everybody's saying the same thing, actually, but I see it as a time of my life where it was time to turn back and say, who am I? And for me personally, I grew up in Watertown. I was an altar boy. I went to Armenian picnics. All these things had been sort of packed away and in some sort of attic in my mind as that was just that. And in fact, they were deeply resonant experiences for me growing up. And now that all those people are gone, all the grandparents and the aunts and so forth, the whole extended family is pretty much gone. Now I want to bring them all back, and I guess this is one way of embracing them again.
I think all of you are married to non-Armenians, as am I, and you were all talking about sort of reconnecting with who you are and how important your Armenian identity has been to that. I'm asking you this question not rhetorically, because it's a question I ask myself every day. How are you going to pass on your identity to your children? Do you feel responsibility to do that? Do you feel challenged by that, or do you just accept that your reality is not their reality and so forth? How will we in America keep up that feeling so that it's not just a museum of memories, but a living thing?
My husband is not Armenian, and I like to think of it less as we're kind of diluting ourselves and more as we're infecting other people. I'm going to Bolis on the 24th, and my husband is going with me. And originally I thought, okay, we'll go to Bolis, and then we'll spend a couple days, and we'll go to the conference, and we'll do the whole being in Istanbul on April 24th thing, and then we'll come back and I'll do some book events. And he was like, absolutely not. We are going to Akhtamar afterwards, and we will go to Hartbert, and then we will go to Hayastan. And so I think that I don't, in terms of our kids, I may actually have to worry about my husband making them more Armenian than I am. It is important, though, and it's something that I've thought about. I'm desperately trying to learn Armenian in case we do have kids, and so they can have the language, because I think it's important. Coming along, it's all right. If anyone has a good Armenian teacher in New York, please come see me. So I think it's important. I think because I think we talk about being Armenian a lot as being a responsibility or a burden, and I just don't think that's true at all. I mean, we have a responsibility to keep up our culture in the same way that everyone does, but I think being Armenian is awesome.
Yeah.
I think it's great. I think we have this century of survival, we're strong, we eat great food, we have fun dances. Like, being Armenian is not a burden. It is an amazing opportunity. It's a wonderful thing. I mean, I think that's why my husband, is kind of joining the party. And so I think if we can pass on this idea that being Armenian is not something you have to do, that you have to go to these events and go to these things, but it's something that it's exciting and it's fun and it's this wonderful part of who we are, that makes it a lot easier. Or is it maybe a better way of looking at it?
My wife is seriously Armo by choice. She's traveled with me through Dukhanagert, through Van, of course, to Yerevan, and going back 25 years, she was the one bringing into the house the Armenian cookbooks because, His Holiness Aaron I once said to me, one of the way to preserve our culture is through the Armenian kitchen. And it's absolutely true. We eat really, really well.
My Irish mother makes the best choreg I've ever had.
My daughters have their great grandparents, respectively, are from Armenia, Albania, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Egypt, Lebanon, and Manchester, England. Just the grandparents, one by they're literally the United Nations of Children. But when we go to England to see your father, who's Egyptian Lebanese, we always go out and eat fine meze that they have there. Like I said, hopefully my family here, my uncle Tony and my aunt Anita, who are here, and we go there on Easter, and I'm hoping to find a little more of it as I go in celebration. I'm waiting to be invited to Armenia so somebody can show me around.
Go to Tumo.
Yeah, see?
Yeah.
So if anybody finds her a teacher, I'll take a guide, and we can work out a deal.
Armenianizing my children, but the very fact that I've just spent all this time, and believe me, if you've been living in my house, this is all you hear about for the last 7 years. And I would say the same has to be true for the other guys sitting here. How can you be in my family and not be totally aware of your Armenian roots, heritage, be proud, how that manifests itself in our lives? I don't, like I said, I don't have a specific program. I will say that whatever it is I've been doing has prompted my younger son to learn on his own Armenian, and to hear him speaking Armenian is kind of weird for me, because when I was growing up, it was just old people spoke Armenian, and I wasn't around fluent Armenian speakers of my own age. But I have to say that my dedication to this project has to speak for itself as far as what my children think about what I think about being Armenian. That's all I can say.
I'm half Armenian. I have a husband who plays the oud beautifully. We have 3 sons, Nishan, David, and Aram, and Nishan speaks Armenian, beautiful Armenian. He studied it in college. So, and they've all embraced. So it's Scout's infection theory. That really works, and it's very parallel to the session, the panel that I was in the audience for just before coming here on reparations. We're uniting our causes with other people. We have to get away from this idea that what makes us Armenian is blood percentages. What makes us Armenian is our spirits, our respect, our history, and therefore we can adopt in as many people as we want. So you will pass that on, I am sure.
But outside of curriculum and school itself, when you're talking about what we can do in the arts, I think that something that's important is we have to start writing plays and books that aren't about the genocide, that are about an Armenian family that has an alcoholic father and a mother who's a dancing girl. We have to go back to the tradition of what is American theater and write about regular people and make them Armenians, because that's what separates us. If we're constantly about the genocide, then it becomes borderline propaganda, and we're not that.
And that's
Scout is saying, look, we're much more than that, so we should do stories about shish kebab backyards like August Wilson does with the African American experience, and do that with generations of Armenians. And now I've given Eric an assignment, but that would be a play that I would want to see, and it would call back to what Scout was talking about, the celebration of it, and not just the badge, which is important, which is truly important.
Well, that's why when I was growing up, the Soroyan stories were so important to me, because this is an ordinary, this is ordinary Armenian life. This felt like my family, and I think even having access to these books in the library, I'm going to be donating some of my books to school libraries. You can buy books and donate them to the library. Even when I was was in 6th or 7th grade, and I had a history teacher, Mrs. Butterworth, and like a good Armenian girl, we had to write a history report. I wrote it on the Armenian genocide, and she told me I had made it up, which obviously is insane. This is Massachusetts. But if I had had books in the school library to back me up, this would have, there was a lot of drama. It took a couple weeks to kind of sort this whole thing out. And if there had been books in the library to back me up, it might have been a little bit easier.
Did Mrs. Butterworth apologize?
No.
I will never feed my daughter that syrup again.
Just yesterday, Professor Hovhannissian said, the world watched, the world condemned, the world did nothing, referring to the Armenian genocide. Paul de Sousa added later that same panel, impunity begets impunity. Certainly, if a country believes it can get away with massacring its own citizens, and it can do so with impunity, that sets a precedent. We are all diminished by what is occurring in Syria. We are all diminished by ISIS. And I do believe as a world we have a moral obligation not merely to watch, not merely to try and look away and go to reality TV, but to talk to our legislators about what we want them to do. And one of the things, just for the record, April 24th is coming. It can't hurt to take a page from change.org and ANCA and ANCC and AYF and ARF and contact your legislators and say that I want my senators to make sure that our senior politicians are in Yerevan on April 24th and that we are using the word genocide this year and not finding euphemisms to appease Turkey.
My question is, I guess, what is different about Operation Nemesis, your book, compared to what Jacques Desrosiers had written?
Jacques Desrosiers' book came out in the 80s, and he did substantial research actually in the ARF archives, which are now no longer open for research. I did further research in the British archives, as well as new things that have come to light. I mean, Marion's letters, translating things that he hadn't translated, translating memoirs that he hadn't translated with Aram, so that we could delve into that. That's some of the new information that's in the book about Operation Nemesis. Specifically, very, very importantly, not only the role of the British, Aubrey Herbert specifically, but also the context for all of this, which overall I've found, and I've read almost every book on the Armenian genocide that you can read, and on Nemesis and on a lot of this history, often is written isolated, like everything is happening within the borders of the Ottoman Empire and are happening, this is all about Armenians, Greeks, Turks, Kurds, but what about what's happening in the greater world beyond the borders of the Ottoman Empire? Because these things are very significant to what happens with the Armenians within the Ottoman Empire. In fact, the ARF was begun outside the Ottoman Empire, and so were the Hunchaks, and this history is important to understand within a context. So my story that I tell in the book is not simply the story of Operation Nemesis. To the best that I can understand today, from what Desrosiers found, from what my research has found, but also to be sure that the reader understands how this all fits together in the greater context. Because I was writing this book with a goal in mind, and I should say that Desrosiers' book is a serious scholarly book and perhaps not accessible for the general reader. You as an Armenian, we just dig into it, can't wait to read more and more endless tiny details about the beginning of the ARF. But for the general reader, my assignment to myself was, how do I make this so that somebody comes to this and finds it irresistible and wants to read more and wants to learn more? But part of my assignment, which was equally difficult was that most people out there don't know much about Armenia or even the Ottoman Empire, or even, I have to just include myself here, the history of World War I, the history of Russia and the Russian Revolution, the history of oil development in the Middle East. All these things come to play, believe it or not, with the story of Operation Nemesis. So that was my assignment to myself. Include all of this and make it compelling so that a person would, basically I'm aiming, although I think Armenians should read this book because I think they should learn some of our basic history, which is in there as a survey, as well as the history of Ottoman Empire. But I was aiming for the general audience who buys Vanity Fair and reads an article about salt or making gloves or something and goes, honey, did you see that? This is incredible. Salt comes from 50% of salt. Because I want them to do that with our story. And I really see this, I don't know if I said this earlier, but I see my book as a kind of a Trojan horse where I want to draw you to this story, and one of the most incredible stories of the 20th century, which is Operation Nemesis. I know of no story like this. They eradicated the government, and they were simple, regular men. But to then, you come to this story for that, and you can't get through my book without learning about the Armenian genocide. No one's going to read this book, and I keep getting response from people who are shocked by what they're reading. Not Armenians, but my smart-ass friends here in New York who know everything, and then they read this book and they go, how did I miss this? Now, I honestly don't know how they missed this. Although, from going to the various other panels while we've been here this last couple of days, if you've seen the things on denial, the Turkish government is spending, great efforts to make sure that they are confused out there. I think we all have to pick our spots, and I think I speak for everybody here on this panel, that we have strengths, and we've brought our strengths to the task at hand that we feel we can do. And I made this little square plot to work and take my spot and make it work. And I think I can get people to read this book, and if I can incrementally increase some knowledge of this great crime, then I feel I've succeeded on some level. So that's all part of what went into it. Honestly, I don't think Jacques Desrosiers' book is on any, you can't walk into Barnes & Noble and find it on the shelves today, or you go to Abril or something and it'll be there, but it's not going to be. So that's why, I mean, things get rewritten about all the time. Operation Paperclip, one of the most insane stories of the Nazis, was written about 15 years ago, and now it's just been written about again, just like last year. It doesn't hurt to get there again.
Thank you.
So we have time, yes. thank
Sorry,
you.
long answer.
We have time of,
It's not a question, just a very brief comment.
we should probably be having questions.
Okay, it's not a
Yeah.
question, just I'm telling you, this day, March 15 of 1921 was the day when Solomon Talleyrand killed Talat Pasha.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. We knew that.
Oh, we're gonna find that. But I have to tell you one other thing. Tomorrow, March 16th, is the day, March 16th, 1921, is the day that the country of Iraq began. And that's part of my book too. It's worth looking at how oil fits in with the tragedy of the Armenians.
What really doesn't bother me, but also I refuse as an Armenian right now, and I'm married to an Armenian as well, to carry this big burden of the genocide wherever I go. I don't want to be recognized as Armenian as a genocide and patted with a little bit Dolma and Sarma. You know what? That's not what I want.
Yeah.
I represent much more than that. I happen to be successful where I am. I happen to see a very successful panel here. We've come a long, long way in the 100 years that we come here. I mean, everywhere I go here, honestly, I'm impressed as to how the Armenians have done and how successful they are. I mean, look at this place, for God's sake, look where we are here. We are in New York City. I mean, this is just a measure of success. So going forward from him, and I will fight to death about the genocide, I will support it and whatever it is. But please, I do not want to be just recognized for that, compartmentalized into that little thing. You have the genocide and what happened to my ancestry. Yes, I will do that. But please, can you give us some direction going forward? How do we give this to our children? It's heavy. It's a very heavy burden to pass on.
Well, this is exactly why I did this book. It's because we're so much more than just, our story didn't start in 1915, it didn't end in 1915, it's not all we are. You know, we're so much more than that. And that's exactly why I did this book.
Yeah, and I agree. As I said before, when I look back at the part of me that remains and will always remain until I'm dead Armenian, though I'm not fully Armenian or half Armenian, but when I look back on that part, I don't think of genocide. I think of Chodik. I think of dancing. I think of my grandmother's music. I think of the food. I don't think of. So I think you're 100% right, and that gets back to what I was saying before. Well, that's right. If you would have told my little Armenian grandmother that she could come to my house, God willing, she could, I wish, and hold my Oscar, that's the most incredible thing. I didn't graduate anything. I came from Washington Heights. So you're right.